Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're tackling a massive historical puzzle behind one of the most famous collections of texts in human history. We're going to look specifically at how the New Testament books actually formed, moving past how they're printed today and reconstructing the real, historical timeline of their creation. Okay, let's dive right into this. I've got a question that honestly trips up even the most seasoned readers. Which New Testament book was written first? Your immediate instinct might be to say the Gospel of Matthew, right? Because, well, when you open the book, that's literally the very first page of the New Testament. But as we're about to see, the story of how these texts formed doesn't actually begin with the Gospels at all. We've got this huge chronological misconception going on. When you look at modern Bibles, whether it's the classic 1611 King James Version or, say, the standard Indonesian Terjemahan Baru, both of which have the exact same 27 books, they're all grouped by literary genre. You get the Gospels, then history, the Pauline epistles, general epistles, and finally Revelation. But the historical reality? The actual timeline of when those 27 books were penned looks incredibly different. It starts with urgent letters, not biographies of Jesus. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the setup, walk through the 4 phases of writing from 45 to 95 AD, and finish up by looking at why this chronological order actually matters. All right, Section 1, the setup and the great misconception. Now, what's really interesting about this is how historians and theologians map it out based on well-researched estimates. We basically have 4 distinct eras. There's the early period, which is focused purely on the first epistles. Then the middle period, introducing Paul's major works and the very first gospel. After that, the late twilight years, marking the final days of those early ministries. And finally, the final period dominated by John. Let's zoom right into those fast-paced early days. Phase 1, the urgent letters, from roughly 45 to 55 AD. This early period was absolute chaos, in the best way possible. The early congregations were expanding rapidly, and the texts written during this time directly reflect that high energy and urgency. Starting between 45 and 48 AD, we get the very first written document, the Book of James. Then, in the early 50s, the Apostle Paul starts writing to the Thessalonians and Galatians. Do you notice what's totally missing here? There are no biographies of Jesus yet. These are pastoral letters rushed across the ancient world on Roman roads, just trying to address immediate, on-the-ground problems in these brand new communities. We really need to emphasize this point. The early Christians didn't just sit down at a desk one day with the intention of writing a Bible. The formation of the New Testament was born out of pure necessity. The leaders were separated from their congregations by hundreds of miles. So they wrote letters to put out pastoral fires, settle disputes, and basically organize the survival of these new groups. Moving on to phase 2, doctrine and the first biographies, right around 55 to 62 AD. So as that initial dust settles, Paul is just incredibly busy. He shifts to these much lengthier, highly doctrinal letters, texts like Romans, which, by the way, was essentially a massive 7,000-word theological treatise. We're setting the complex theological foundation for the whole church. He's no longer just putting out fires, he's building a comprehensive framework for how this new faith actually operates. But something else entirely new was happening in the background during this exact same window. And this brilliantly illustrates our first major narrative pivot. Right alongside Paul's deep theological letters, around 55 to 60 AD, oral traditions about Jesus started being officially recorded. The Gospel of Mark becomes the very first gospel ever written, and Matthew follows pretty soon after, around 60 AD. For over a decade, everything was just letters, right? And now, suddenly, the first biographies emerge. Next up, phase 3, the twilight years, spanning 62 to 68 AD. During this window, the tone changes. The original leaders are aging, and they're facing imminent martyrdom, particularly under Emperor Nero in Rome. Because of this pressure, we see a massive surge in historical accounts. Luke writes his gospel and the Acts of the Apostles to meticulously document their history, while leaders are writing highly personal pastoral epistles, like 1 Timothy, Titus, and 1 Peter. They're actively preparing to pass the torch to the next generation. The poignancy here is just striking. Look at 2 Timothy, estimated around 66 AD. That is Paul's very last letter before his death. 2 Peter follows shortly after. These aren't just administrative documents anymore. These are literally the final written words of the founding figures on the eve of their executions. Which brings us to phase 4, the last eyewitness, from 85 to 95 AD. Now, we actually make a massive time jump here, almost 20 years. By this point, the Apostle John is the only original apostle left alive. He lived the longest out of all of them. And because of that, his specific texts serve as the capstone of first-century theology. He writes the final biography of Jesus, the Gospel of John, around 85 AD, followed by his 3 distinct letters in the 90s. So the crucial point is around 95 AD, when John writes Revelation. It's fascinating because modern Bibles stick this at the very end, purely because of its apocalyptic genre. But chronologically, it actually is the final piece of the puzzle. The canon is effectively closed by the last surviving eyewitness, right at the end of the 1st century. Finally, Section 6, why this timeline actually matters. Okay, so we've just mapped out 50 years of history. And when you rearrange these 27 books from their genre-based layout back into their real-time order, it gives us a completely different lens on history. Think about it. Why did they wait so long to write the Gospels? The oral traditions were always there, sure, but the first written Gospel didn't appear until roughly 10 to 15 years after the first letters were already circulating. Why the delay? When you trace it chronologically, this brilliant problem and solution narrative pops right out. Step 1. The earliest Christians were entirely focused on the present. They addressed immediate structural and behavioral challenges directly through letters. But then, Step 2. Time passes. They suddenly realize that the original eyewitnesses to Jesus are aging and starting to pass away. The living memories are fading. So, Step 3. They change their strategy. They realize they absolutely must record official written biographies, the Gospels, so that those accounts aren't lost to history. What we're witnessing here is a profound shift, both psychologically and practically, in the minds of early Christians. They completely transitioned from simply trying to solve immediate daily church issues to actively working to preserve a permanent history. Seeing the texts in the order they were actually written reveals this exact evolution of Christian theology, happening in real time, right across the pages. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. When you pull back the curtain of standard printing layouts and look at the raw chronological formation of these texts, how does reading the New Testament in this real-time order change the way you understand its history? Doesn't it make the authors feel a little more human, reacting to the pressures of time and survival? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this structured look at the timeline leaves you eager to reevaluate how you look at ancient texts. Until next time, keep learning and keep asking those great questions.